Good evening, everyone. I'm Rayhan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and I'm honored to be here tonight sharing the stage with Commissioner Bill Bratton and MI's O'Neill Family Fellow, Rafael Mangual. It is great to see so many of our friends in the audience, including MI's President Emeritus Larry Moan, and our trustees Ravenel Curry, Ann Charters, and Nick O'Neill, and to celebrate the release of Ralph's brilliant new book, Criminal Injustice. This book represents the culmination of years of Ralph's hard work. Not long ago, the conventional wisdom held that the biggest problem with our criminal justice system was that it was far too punitive, and that what urban neighborhoods needed most was for the police to stop being so proactive in their efforts to fight crime. Ralph warned that this was a dire mistake, that the crime decline that transformed America's great cities was a fragile achievement, and that cities around the country would regret their headlong rush towards depolicing and decarceration. Needless to say, he's been proven right, and Ralph has dedicated his professional life to doing everything in his power to restore public safety, especially for our most vulnerable citizens. It is therefore fitting that Ralph's introducer tonight is Commissioner Bill Bratton. Over the course of his long and distinguished career, Commissioner Bratton has saved countless lives. He oversaw the NYPD's transformative implementation of broken windows policing in the 1990s, which greatly contributed to the city's massive crime decline in that decade. And he led a similarly dramatic transformation at the LAPD during the 2000s. At the federal level, Commissioner Bratton has served with distinction on the Homeland Security Advisory Council, which he now co-chairs. And today, he is the executive chairman of the consulting firm Teneo Risk and the author of The Profession, a memoir of community, race, and the arc of policing in America. I'm proud to say that Commissioner Bratton has had a long and fruitful relationship with the Manhattan Institute. His signature policing strategy grew from his intellectual partnership with the late George Kelling, the renowned MI scholar who co-authored the 1982 article that first introduced the concept of broken windows policing to the public. Kelling and Commissioner Bratton worked together on a 1994 piece for City Journal explaining the NYPD strategy for fighting crime, which has proven enormously influential. He's also served as an exceedingly generous mentor, collaborator, and friend to Ralph. And with that, I'll hand it over to Commissioner Bratton.
First, the commercial. Don't walk, run to buy this book. It is extraordinary, and I'll speak about it in a moment. But first, a thank you. A thank you to the Manhattan Institute for its sponsorship of tonight's event. But thank you in the Institute for the work that you've done over the decades to try to shine a light on how to do things the right way and not to do them the wrong way. Because right at the moment, we need a bright light on what's going on because it's being done the wrong way. And that's the strength of Rafael's book. It is the right book at the right time, because it takes apart so much of the misinformation, the lies, the misrepresentation of so many of the ideas that are tearing our city, our state, and our country apart. Ralph will tell you, he'll be the first to tell you, Rafael, that he's not to the right, he's not to the left. He wants both sides to listen, to read, to see the strong arguments that he has developed from his years of research and his exposure to some of the best minds in the criminal justice system in America, a lot of them introduced to him through his relationship with the Manhattan Institute. His parents are here tonight, his very proud parents, and I can see where Rafael comes from. the spitting image. Maybe Raphael's, I keep calling him Ralph, but it's Rafael, that I guess the English version of Rafael. Rafael, maybe the origins of his interest in this subject came from his dad, who was a detective in the NYPD for 20 years during the turbulent 80s, 90s, and then in the aftermath of 9/11. So during a period of time of extraordinary change. So, sir, thank you for your service to this city. And to you and your wife, thank you for Rafael. I had the opportunity to meet Rafael several years ago. George Kelling was in his last year of life. He had had a long bout with cancer. George was a friend, colleague, mentor, co-author. He's just an extraordinary individual who had great influence on these issues. His seminal work with Jim Wilson, Broken Windows. I was the practitioner of Broken Windows, and I put their theories into practice with great success, because they understood that you could not focus just on serious crime. You also had to focus on the disorder, the broken windows that people saw every day, the disorder that we are not attending to with any effectiveness at the moment. Rafael, in his book, basically looks at all of these issues and explains the importance of them. But I first met him when I went to visit George in Hanover, New Hampshire, where he was living with his wife, Catherine Cole, and went up there 4 times during that last year. And on the first visit, there was a young man working with George, and they were collaborating on something that was of great interest to George. In his last year on this earth, George was very disappointed that so much of what he has spent his life devoted to, trying to educate the importance of community policing, the importance of broken windows, that it was being attacked, and being attacked successfully, unfortunately. And so the idea that he was about to leave this life, his life's work, was being torn apart. And he had the good fortune in that last year to meet Rafael. And I'd like to think that a lot of the influence in this magnificent book was through that exposure to George. George's last work for the Manhattan Institute was a 3,000-word effort that co-authored by Rafael, effectively defending community policing. And that community policing effectively was what could make America safe. So from that exposure to Rafael, developed a friendship, an admiration, a mentorship, not only of me, of him, but him of me. Because he's an extraordinary young man with an extraordinary research capability, and most importantly, the ability to take what he has learned, what he has analyzed, and present it in a user-friendly fashion. So many academics, so many writers, so many researchers, they effectively write for themselves and other researchers. Rafael writes for the people, on the left, on the right, in the center. The idea of trying to bring them to common ground, the idea of this issue of public safety is too important to be in the trenches throwing hand grenades at each other constantly, but trying to find a way to get us out of those trenches on the left and the right, and to get us into what is no man's land and have it become common ground. With this book, he pushes back on a lot of the misinformation that has taken hold over these last 10 years, and I'm hoping that if we can advocate forcefully for it, myself and many others who will have the opportunity to read it, we can begin to turn the tide, this negative tide that has engulfed America over these last half-dozen years. We're in a perilous place at the moment, but New Yorkers, we're in a perilous place in years past, and we got through it. And we got through it with hard work, we got through it with inspiration, we got through it with knowledge. Rafael's hard work is providing us inspiration. It's providing us with knowledge. It's providing us with the groundwork, the platform to stand on, to begin to make a difference, to once again take back our city from those who would destroy it, take back our state, and take back our country. My prediction is that this will be as influential in the criminal justice world as Broken Windows was back in the 1980s. Why? Because it's common sense. It makes sense. So Rafael, thank you for your incredible contribution to this area of research, but more importantly, to the real world. Thank you.
Wow. You know, when you get an introduction like that from someone as important as Commissioner Bratton, just before you deliver a talk about your first book in a great room like this one, at a club associated with one of the most elite universities in the world, it becomes basically impossible to resist the sense of accomplishment that I'm feeling right now. And so before I get into the talk, I want to just take a quick moment, a brief moment, to acknowledge some of the people who have helped me get to where I am. My family, my mom, my dad, my wife, friends, mentors, but also the supporters of the Manhattan Institute, the organization that has given me a professional home, our trustees, and in particular, Mr. Nick O'Neill, who has not only just generously supported this project, but has been an incredible supporter of my work and the work of the Institute for years now. And I just want you all to know how deeply appreciative I am for that support. I couldn't have done it without you. So now, if I'm being honest, my sense of accomplishment, I think, makes me a bit uneasy. And the reason for that is that it's in tension with the reality that's always animated my work on these issues, the issues that I'm here to discuss. And that reality is that this isn't about me. Tonight, this book, the debate that it contributes to, are first and foremost about the far too many victims of the sort of injustices that inspired my book's title. Injustices like the 2019 murder detailed in the book's introduction of a young, unarmed Chicago mother allegedly shot by a parolee with 9 prior felony convictions, including one for second-degree murder. Injustices like the little boy who was forced to run for his life in that same city earlier this summer, backpack in tow, as he dodged bullets meant for the group of young men he made the mistake of walking past at the time. Injustices like the young woman police say was stabbed to death in her Lower East Side apartment earlier this year by a homeless career criminal with not 1, not 2, but with 3 open cases. And finally, like the incredibly strong woman who was robbed of her husband, Detective Jason Rivera, a man many of us watched her eulogize after he and his partner, Wilbert Mora, were murdered by a repeat offender out on probation. I wrote this book largely because I was tired of reading stories about the heinous crimes carried out by offenders who had no business being out on the street. Stories that the data make clear are not outliers. And I wanted to do something about it, a desire that only grew as I watched 2020 unfold. In the wake of George Floyd's murder and all of the unrest and political grandstanding that followed it, politicians and activists saw to the enactment of a wave of policy proposals that were explicitly aimed at systematically lowering the transaction costs of crime commission and raising the transaction costs of law enforcement. According to the New York Times, more than 30 states collectively passed more than 140 police reform bills in the year following George Floyd's death. This was an unprecedented acceleration of a trend that had been slowly taking shape since at least 2010. And to my mind, the acceleration of this policy agenda was going to do real damage to public safety, particularly in the communities that reformers say they wanted to help. Hence the subtitle, What the Push for Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong, and Who It Hurts Most. So I was entirely unsurprised when 2020 saw homicides spike 30% across the United States, the largest one-year increase in generations. And I remained unsurprised by the fact that between 2020 and 2021, more than a dozen cities set all-time records for homicides, and more than a dozen more cities flirted with their 1990s peaks. Over the last several years, serious violent crime, shootings, homicides in particular, became a much larger problem here in America, but not one whose effects are evenly distributed throughout our society. Criminal violence has long been, both geographically and demographically, hyper-concentrated. Here in New York, about 3.5% of street segments see about 50% of the city's violent crime. And every year, for well over a decade, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims in this city are either Black or Hispanic, the vast majority of them male. Uncomfortable as it may make people in certain circles, you'll see similar disparities in the statistics of shooting suspects. Nationally, Black males constitute between 6 and 7% of the population, but are murdered at nearly 10 times the rate of their white counterparts. And crimes like homicide are tightly clustered in a relative handful of neighborhoods in and around American cities. For example, in 2019, the national murder rate was 5 per 100,000. The 10 most dangerous Chicago neighborhoods, on the other hand, which are 95.7% Black or Latino, 2019 homicide rate was a whopping 61.7 per 100,000. Now, as high as that number is, it actually understates how dangerous some of those neighborhoods actually are. West Garfield Park, for example, had a 2019 murder rate of 131 per 100,000. Now, my book highlights data like these for 2 reasons. First, I think a thorough understanding of how violence is and has long been concentrated helps us understand exactly who it is that will suffer the most should a particular policy program diminish public safety, and, by logical extension, who it is that will gain the most should a particular policy program enhance public safety. Which takes us to the second reason I highlight these data. The reality of crime concentration can help contextualize some of the disparities in enforcement statistics that we hear so much about. Disparities that are often seized upon to make the case for mass decarceration and depolicing as a means of pursuing racial equity. If, in fact, the most serious crimes are occurring in very small slices of our cities and are affecting a particular demographic group more than others, then it is entirely reasonable for enforcement resources to be disproportionately deployed to these areas and, by extension, to see disparities arise from that uneven distribution of law enforcement resources. In other words, if we accept as legitimate the decision to police neighborhoods where victimization rates are highest, we must also accept as legitimate that police are going to interact disproportionately with the people spending time in those neighborhoods. And to focus on the disparate rate of interactions in a vacuum is to ignore really important context that, when accounted for, undermines the assertion that law enforcement disparities are driven exclusively by racial animus. Another example of this very thing can be found in the studies of racial disparities in incarceration, which show that when you control for the type and severity of the crime committed, as well as for the age and criminal histories of the offenders in question, the racial disparities in sentencing shrink substantially, leading us to the same conclusion drawn by the National Academies of Sciences in the 2014 meta-analysis of the literature on disparities in incarceration, which I will quote verbatim. Quote, "Racial bias and discrimination are not the primary causes of disparities in sentencing decisions or rates of imprisonment. Overall, when statistical controls are used to take account of offense characteristics, prior criminal records, and personal characteristics, Black defendants are on average sentenced somewhat, but not substantially, more severely than whites." Contextualizing the data that inform our criminal justice debate is a major theme of this book, because placing the data in their proper context often mutes the rhetorical impact of some of the harshest critiques of American criminal justice. Two prominent examples of this include the charges that America has a mass incarceration and police violence problem. Let's start with mass incarceration. We often hear it lamented that the United States houses just 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners, or that the US has an incarceration rate that is significantly higher than that of other developed democracies. But much of that difference can be attributed to the simple, if sad, fact that the United States is home to many, many more pockets of highly concentrated criminal violence. Violence of the sort that would result in lengthy prison terms, even in the countries that we're so often unfavorably compared with. In 2018, Germany, England, and Wales experienced approximately 3,200 homicides, with a combined population of 142.2 million people. By contrast, just a few neighborhoods in just 4 American cities, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and Baltimore, with a combined population of just over 470,000, saw 336 homicides that year. In other words, just a few American neighborhoods saw more than 10% of the homicides experienced in 3 whole countries, despite housing less than 0.5% of those countries' combined population. I would also note here that Germany sentences a higher percentage of convicted murderers to life in prison than does the US. And in the UK, the mandatory minimum for illegal gun possession is 5 years in prison. Such offenses are regularly met with probation in cities like New York. So no, our comparatively higher incarceration rate is not primarily a function of a more punitive approach to crime. What about police violence? Well, it turns out that it's thankfully gotten way less common over the last few decades and is now not very common at all. In 1971, the NYPD shot over 220 people. That number is now down in the low 20s. The problem is that you wouldn't know this from listening to the critiques of law enforcement that are often amplified in our nation's legacy media outlets. What you'll see a lot of, if you're just a casual consumer of the media's coverage of police, is a hyper-focus on statistically rare but highly salient anecdotes of alleged police misconduct, as well as data on police use of force that is presented in the least favorable light possible. Now, sometimes the injustice of a particular police action is plain to even the untrained eye. The murder of George Floyd is, I think, a clear example of that. But the reality is that police use force somewhere in the range of 1% of all arrests. They fire their guns in about 0.03% of all arrests. In one study of over 1 million calls for service across 3 police departments, calls that resulted in more than 114,000 criminal arrests, police officers used physical force in less than 1% of those arrests. And in that entire data set, it captures just one fatal police shooting. And in 98% of the cases in which police did use force in that data set, the suspect sustained either no or very mild injury. Now, as important as it is to me that you all understand the statistical realities that I present in the book and that I've mentioned here tonight, it's even more important to me that you understand what I am not arguing. I am not arguing that the criminal justice system is perfect. I am not arguing that there isn't a subset of America's prison and jail populations constituted by people whose incarceration does not serve a legitimate penological end. I am not arguing that police don't make mistakes or abuse their power, and I am not arguing that when cops do mess up, that the mechanisms meant to ensure accountability are batting 1,000. However, the fact that the institutions traditionally relied upon to play major roles in the provision of public safety aren't perfect does not justify the sorts of radical reorganizations or reimaginings being proposed today in the name of equity. Calls for mass decarceration and depolicing must be forcefully resisted, not out of antipathy for criminal offenders, but out of a deep and sincere empathy for the communities that those offenders harm. Such resistance begins with understanding precisely what it is that the advocates of this misguided program get wrong and who they'll hurt most if they get their way. Only then can we bring true justice to the communities suffering under the weight of America's violent crime problem. Thank you. So with that, I think we have some time for audience questions. So just raise your hand. Is there a mic going around? I think there may be. If not, yes, there is. So just raise your hand, wait for the mic, and we'll go from there. Okay, gentleman in the blue shirt back here, mic is coming to you.
I guess if you were running the NYPD and then just based on, the statistics you enumerated, like what 3 or 4 things would you do differently than what's being done right now to remedy this?
I'm not sure I would do much very differently. I mean, one of the biggest problems that I see when I look at the data on criminal justice outcomes are data, for example, like out of the city of Chicago, where the average homicide or shooting suspect has 12 prior arrests, where 20% of those individuals have more than 20 prior arrests. We see the same thing a lot here in New York City. What that tells you is that the police department is actually doing a pretty good job of focusing its resources on the individuals that pose the greatest dangers to their communities. What it also tells you is that the criminal justice system around policing is failing to do its part to back them up in those efforts. And so I do think that what the NYPD learned from the 1990s is being continued today. They are continuing to deploy resources to the neighborhoods that need them most, to the places where crime is most concentrated, hot spots, so to speak. But what we, I think, have failed to truly understand and appreciate as a society, particularly in this city, is that the efforts of the NYPD can only do so much good as the rest of the criminal justice system will allow them to do. And if prosecutors refuse to prosecute, and judges refuse to incarcerate, and parole boards refuse to hold anybody inside, the effects of an NYPD officer's arrest on the community's safety is going to be increasingly muted, and I think that's where we are today. Question here up front. Hang on for the mic here.
What pieces of legislation have been passed in possibly the last 2 years up in Albany have created this mess?
Absolutely. So there are a few things that have happened on the criminal justice reform front at the state level. So we've had the bail reform, which I'm sure you've all heard about, right? And I'm sure you've all heard, been told and assured in the New York Times that it's not having any impact on crime. Don't you worry. Well, they're wrong. It's plainly obvious that they're wrong. What they like to do is they like to kind of aggregate the criminal offending population into one big pile, and they say that, hey, well, these individuals who have maybe one prior arrest or who are first-time offenders, yeah, they're not going out and hurting anyone. What they fail to tell you is that when we look at the population of people that are most likely to be held in a system that's properly functioning with respect to pretrial detention, those individuals have a very, very high recidivism rate. And one of the things that we've seen here in New York is a massive jump in the share of offenders, particularly violent offenders, who have open cases. So both with respect to total arrest and violent felony arrest in New York City, we have seen a 25% increase in the share of offenders constituted by people who have open cases. I think that's a major hole in the bail reform defense. The other piece of legislation, which was passed alongside bail reform, was discovery reform, which drastically increased the compliance burden associated with bringing a criminal prosecution in New York State. This was done without any funding to allow prosecutors to absorb that new burden. And I think that was done by design. This is a starve the beast kind of approach to criminal justice. We don't like this thing, so let's give that thing way more work that we know it can't handle and no new money with which to do it, which has forced prosecutors to spend increasing amounts of time doing grunt work and paperwork, which has raised the transaction costs of a criminal prosecution, forcing prosecutors to triage cases and decide not to bring charges at all or to delay them entirely. Those really misguided legislative efforts have been backed up by raise the age or preceded by raise the age requirements, which have made it nearly impossible to charge even the most chronic teenage offenders in adult criminal court, which has had disastrous results. We've seen a huge recidivism rate jump within that population. And now, of course, we have the less is more legislation, which makes it more difficult to send people back to prison for violating their parole terms or probation terms. These are, I think, just very characteristic of the move to decarcerate on a massive scale. I think they will prove to be disastrous for the city of New York, as they have proven to be disastrous in other jurisdictions as well.
I was going to ask, especially in light of sort of political changes we've had in New York City, Eric Adams, at least he talks a good game on sort of, wanting to curb crime and so on. Where does this, politically, where does this impetus to sort of, defend criminals and sort of put them back on the street, where does this come from? And, what is the kind of, how do you see it? How did it come about? And sort of, how do you think it can be solved?
I think part of it comes from a fading memory of how bad things were in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, as well as a faded memory of how we got to the point that we got to in the mid-2000s. Safety makes us all comfortable, and it reduces the sense that we have to have a sense of urgency with respect to issues surrounding public safety. And so I think it's also made people much less comfortable with operating a system that has long been characterized as overly punitive. And I think there also is some evidence to suggest that we overcorrected in the 1990s in the punitive direction. The problem is that that has been met with an attempt to throw the baby out with the bathwater rather than reform at the margins, which is what should have been done. Right? Again, I don't think anyone worth their salt would ever argue that the criminal justice system is perfect, that it's never made mistakes. The question is what risks are we willing to take with the lives of people who live in neighborhoods that most people in this room, understandably, would never dare set foot in? What risks are we willing to take with their lives as a result of wanting to make ourselves feel better? And I think there are a lot of people who have been made to feel guilty by virtue of the misrepresentation of what the data on criminal justice say, and they are trying to assuage that guilt by backtracking in ways that have been absolutely disastrous for low-income communities of color.
Kenny Shu, you said in your speech that the U.S. has a disproportionate percentage of its population incarcerated, but that it's not due to more punitive laws, and then you went on to cite various punitive laws that European countries have done and so far. But the fact still remains that the U.S. still has a significantly larger portion of its population incarcerated than these European countries. And so why is that?
Simply because we have a lot more crime. Again, most of the United States is as safe as any safe place in the world. What's different here is that we have a number of pockets of concentrated crime that a crime that occurs at levels I think it would be very, very difficult for most people to imagine. When you talk about, you know, a homicide rate of 131 per 100,000 like exists in West Garfield Park, we understand that as an abstraction, as a comparison to what the national rate is, but we have no idea what that's really like in terms of living in a community. And what it means is when you leave the house, you genuinely don't know if you're going to have to fight at some point during the day before you come home. You genuinely don't know if you're going to have to dodge a bullet. The United States has a lot of that. This is something that a lot of people understand in the context of the gun control debate. We often hear it, you know, highlighted that, well, we have so many guns here in the U.S., and that's why we have such a higher violent crime rate than other Western European democracies. But then we completely forget that reality when we talk about disparities in incarceration. I think we would do well to remember that terrible distinction that the United States has, work to correct it. But the main reason why we incarcerate so many people compared to lots of other countries is our crime. Also, the fact that we have a lot more resources with which to do this than a lot of other countries, right? Brazil has significantly more violent crime than the United States, but a lower incarceration rate. I don't think that's because Brazil prefers not to incarcerate potential murderers and robbers and rapists. It's just that they don't have the sort of wealth that the United States has at its disposal to dedicate to its criminal justice apparatus. My friend here on the left.
So fantastic job again on this book, and congratulations. Many cities are struggling with either early retirement of their police forces or struggling to recruit police officers. President Biden, I think, has recently reversed course and now endorses increasing funding for police departments. People on the Republican side also do the same. My question is an increase in funding enough to address the retention and hiring problems that police departments are facing, or do you have any other recommendations for this problem?
I don't think it's enough, in part because I don't think that the recruitment and retention crisis is simply a function of the resources being dedicated to recruitment and retention. We have seen, particularly over the last couple of years, the profession of policing, and it is a profession, be demonized in a way that I don't think any other profession has ever really seen. And it makes people really question themselves. Why on earth would I take a job that requires me to wear a bulletproof vest and have a gun on my hip to do, only to be, you know, if only metaphorically, spit on by the public that I'm risking my life to serve? These are questions I asked myself in 2010 when I took the LSAT and the NYPD exam in the same week. My father, who's sitting here today, talked me out of becoming a cop precisely because of the reality that even back then, police officers couldn't count on the support of their communities, of their cities, of the news media when they were engaged in something that looked controversial on video. And so I think lots of people, particularly people that we want in policing, people who have high levels of educational attainment, who have high levels of psychological stability, people that we want to become cops and serve their communities, these are also people who have other options. And when they weigh those options alongside a career in policing, it's not at all surprising to me, given the rhetoric of the last 2 years, that they choose those other options. And we're all worse off for it. What I really, really don't want to see happen in the United States, particularly in New York City, is for the delta between the average cop and the average perp to shrink. And that's exactly what we're going to see if we make policing the sort of job that only people without options want to do. Thank you. I think we have one question there in the back row.
Unfortunately, we're moving in that direction as far as choosing police officers. And we see a lot of cities lowering requirements at exactly the wrong time. But that's not the issue I wanted to bring up. 65 people were shot in Chicago over the last weekend. The majority of them were shot in what we normally would call drive-bys. Supposedly, they were not known to the people who shot them. What is the impact, and I think this raises the impact, of drugs and gangs on these shootings? Most of these shootings, I would predict, as a former police officer, were retaliatory, involving drugs and gangs and possibly someone who ratted on someone else. And this is an issue that politicians and the media refuse to address. and it ties very much into your discussion of that it's primarily young minority males shooting other young minority males, that only gets attention when a few quote-unquote innocent people are caught up in the gunplay.
Yeah, I think you make some really good points there. And the direct answer to your question is that gangs are playing a huge part of the shooting violence in the city of Chicago. Drugs a much smaller part than you would think. The DEA unclassified a report, I think in 2015, that actually looked at the percentage of shootings that were a result of drug-related gang beefs, and I think it was only 5% of all the shootings. However, gang-related shootings constituted the majority, or at least a large plurality of all shootings. But the drug point is a really interesting one, because oftentimes when we talk about the drug debate, we often hear lots of terrible stories about people spending decades in prison on end for simple drug possession, which of course doesn't actually really happen. Only about 14% of all state prisoners are incarcerated primarily for a drug offense. Most of them have very violent criminal histories, very lengthy criminal histories. But it also ignores the fact that the drug enforcement isn't really about drug use, right? Drug enforcement is often understood by police to be a tool through which to pretextually attack more serious violent crime. It's one of the reasons that crack was treated so much more harshly than powder cocaine in the 1980s, right? We hear a lot about the sort of racist construction of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which established the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. What people don't tell you is that the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was co-sponsored by 16 of the 19 members of the Congressional Black Caucus at the time. Not just voted for, but co-sponsored. It passed the Senate by a vote, I think, of 97-3. Black Americans played a huge role in the advent of the Rockefeller drug laws here in New York City, which established mandatory minimums for crack cocaine. It's a really wonderful book by a great scholar that I would recommend to all of you called Black Silent Majority by a guy named Michael J. Fortner. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that when we hear talk about drug decriminalization or ending the drug war, we're also talking about taking a really important tool out of the belt of law enforcement officers who are trying to impact violent crime any way that they can. And there is a massive overlap between people who engage in drug offenses and people who engage in serious violent offenses. One quick statistic on this: in 2017, the Baltimore Police Department identified over 100 homicide suspects. 7 in 10 had at least one prior arrest for drugs. So the idea that drug offender can be understood to mean nonviolent offender, I think is deeply wrong, deeply misguided. And so when we hear about drugs, I think it's important to make the point that you made, which is that they actually do drive some of the most serious forms of violence, certainly did a lot more in the past, but that is a tool that police officers, I think, need to retain, at least in the near term. Any others? We've got a second question here. Can we do that? Hang on one second. The mic is coming to you. We have another. Why don't we give her a shot, because she hasn't asked a question yet.
It's actually for Gavin.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
I was actually, that's fine. She asked my previous question. I was going to ask about the disparity between the U.S. and Europe with gang-related violence, especially among gun violence. But I was going to maybe ask a more generic question. You touched on it kind of throughout your speech. How much of this is less of a policing issue? Obviously, these police departments are, well-oiled machines. They understand the tactics. They understand the philosophy behind, the criminology, et cetera. And more of this is just a failure of the judicial process, the prosecutorial process, and how can we fix that system through actual legislative reform? How can we force these DAs to actually do their job, effectuate on their mandates, and prosecute crime rather than simply letting their communities fall into chaos and criminality?
Yeah, I think the general answer to your question is that through the political process. I don't think we can force prosecutors to prosecute when they don't want to. What we can do is stop voting in prosecutors who have been very open about what they're going to do if they win the election. Okay? Alvin Bragg did not hide the fact that he wanted to decarcerate on a massive scale. You could have gone on his website months before the election and read exactly what he was going to say in his memo that everyone was so shocked to read. What we've done is we've kind of really pretended that the rest of the criminal justice system continues to operate like a well-oiled machine that doesn't need maintenance, that doesn't need oversight, and I think we've learned that that's wrong. Larry Krasner, the radical DA in Philadelphia, was reelected, sailed to reelection, but I think just 17% of eligible voters came out in that primary. So, this is a political problem that I think requires a political solution. Are there good ideas that are waiting in the wings? Yes. One of those good ideas is to stop all the bad ideas, to roll those back. That's a good place to start. But I think we're starting to see that there was a real, perhaps even really good reason for policies like 3 strikes and you're out, policies like truth in sentencing. Is 3 the right number? Probably not. Maybe it's 5. But I know that I'm tired, absolutely tired, exhausted of reading stories about people who have 15, 20, 30 prior arrests, 10 prior convictions, who are out on the street free to kill, to rape, to maim, to rob, to terrorize. These are real communities with real people trying to go about their everyday lives. They deserve better than what they're getting. Okay, I'm being signaled that that's all the time that we have. Thank you all so very much for coming. It's truly an honor. Thank you.